Hi.
Hello, folks. In the prior segments, Ray goes to great lengths to lay out the reality that he saw as a governing body member, that the myth of the anointed feeding the other sheep is really, well, it is that. It's a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
It's a myth, it's a fiction, it's a workable myth, though, and he wants to explore as to why this masking over reality, what purpose does it serve in the Watchtower world? So he begins on page 163 of In Search of Christian Freedom this way. What then does the fictional teaching about a worldwide administrative and spiritual food supplying slave class accomplish? It provides a prime basis on which the organization's authority rests, by which a small group of men, whose number represents, get this, only 1/7 of 1% of the 8,800 anointed, assumes the right to determine not only what all the anointed, but in fact all witnesses will read, study, believe, and practice. By its stress on a class, it also serves to robe the real authority structure with a shroud of anonymity, giving the appearance of a wide diversity of membership and globality that is not of whole cloth, simply not true. This fictional concept enables the real authority structure, the dozen or so members of the governing body, to ask for almost total obedience to their own directives without appearing as arrogant or self-serving. If, for example, they were to say, quote, any person engaged in a type of employment that we 12 men here in Brooklyn have decided is wrong must either quit or be disfellowshipped, unquote, the focus would be on them and the tremendous power they exert over the lives of the individual members of the worldwide community of witnesses. By speaking of the faithful and discreet slave class, attention is diverted from the small power group as the true authority structure. As the slave class, that authority source takes on a certain vagueness, an amorphous quality, and an extensiveness belonging to an essentially faceless aggregation that is not definable or identifiable in any real sense for the average member. The euphemistic use of the expression, and surprisingly, their own belief in the concept, also enables the governing body members to publish statements calling for almost total submission to their decisions without being troubled personally by a sense of arrogance.
The Watchtower's multifaceted claims regarding a slave class formed of a collective body of anointed ones prove, one after the other, to be unsupportable, even fictional. What message, then, does this parable of the Master genuinely bring to us? Now there's a new subheading, Christian stewardship, and he leads into it by quoting 1 Peter chapter 4:10. Quote, in proportion as each one has received a gift, use it in ministering to one another as fine stewards of God's undeserved kindness expressed in various ways. End of quote. Now, Ray comments, the greatest objection to the Watchtower Society's heavy and constant emphasis on an organizational slave as fulfilling Christ's parable is that it robs the parable of much of its force. The real lesson is lost in the parable, and the parable serves the principal purpose of a prop supporting an exercise of religious authority by the small group of men forming the governing body.
There is nothing wrong of itself with describing as a class those Christians who fulfill in their lives the things taught in Jesus' parable of the faithful and discreet slave. A class can refer to a number of persons who have similar characteristics, who share similar qualities, or hold certain principles in common, or who engage in a similar course in life. But this does not require that they form part of or be tied in with some system or structured group. They are of that class because of what they are as persons, not because of what they belong to or hold membership in with regard to some organization. The term, for example, is often used to refer to persons who share the same economic or social status, the wealthy class, or the educated class, or the underprivileged class, and so forth, without regard for any organizational affiliation they may or may not have. In this sense, all Christians are of the same class. They should all share certain identifying characteristics, hold beliefs and principles in common, follow a similar course in their walk in life, be subject to the same headship. Persons who manifest the same qualities often associate together, drawn to one another because of a common viewpoint and belief and hope, or because of mutual standards. Christians similarly should feel drawn to one another for these reasons and because of mutual love. But the fact remains that it is because they have those qualities as individuals that their likeness and their affinity exists, not because of their being members of some visible organization, an institutionalized association. The body of Christ, to which class all anointed Christians belong, is a spiritual body, its members not identified by earthly organizational membership.
The Watchtower organization uses the term class in a very different way. It sets aside the normal sense of the term and gives it its own special meaning. It states that the designation of the slave class applies to persons only as they form part of an organization-connected class, and therefore the designation does not and cannot have an individual application to anyone not affiliated with that particular visible organization. No matter what Christian characteristics, beliefs, qualities, and course of life a person manifests, these are not determinative in identifying him or her as the slave class. Connection with the Watchtower organization is an indispensable requirement. Without that, all other factors lose their force in identifying one as of the faithful and discreet slave class. Thus, the organization sets not only its own definition of the class, but also its own parameters determining who can qualify to be within the class and who remains outside.
Well, in titling this section "Masking Over Reality," we made the point in the in our comments on the prior sections that the mask is now completely off. Here it's slipping in the 1980s when Ray is reacting already to the changes that had happened in the years since he had been disfellowshipped, and the mask is off in that this class system is a total fiction. It creates a class system which is not a fiction. In effect, the Watchtower clergy, which was then 12 men, is now 8 men. The Watchtower clergy class, priesthood, is a far more dangerous thing than the clergy, which they obviously so despise.
Yeah. It seems ironic that they make a point of talking about this class system within Christendom, the clergy and the congregation.
Laity, as they call it.
Yeah, the clergy and the laity. And yet they have nowhere near the control or power over their people as the Watchtower does.
Absolutely. So if there's a class system in operation on earth that's very effective, it is this fiction, this myth of the faithful and discreet slave class.
Yeah.
And I think as you look at the New Testament, you see, if you read it closely, that even the apostles didn't have this kind of power.
No, not near that power, because you remember that Paul was being criticized and
constantly.
Yeah, he was being accused of not really being an apostle.
Even doubted by the congregations he founded in Corinth. So
Right.
if you need more on that, read specifically 2 Corinthians, the whole thing. 1 Corinthians is not without allusions to it as well. But 2 Corinthians, especially the last 4 or 5 chapters, are full of these allusions to Paul having to prove who he is, prove his authority all over again to the people who were in the congregation he had founded.
And when he writes to them, it's not with the kind of authority that you get from the governing body here. You know, it's always appeals. It's exhorting. It's not demanding because I'm an apostle or I'm of the faithful and discreet slave. And even in the epistles of John, you have John being threatened with being thrown out of the congregation.
Yeah, read 3rd John. I remember when I first contemplated what this tiny little epistle, which is less than half a page long in any Bible. This is just full of references to somebody in the local congregation apparently trying to get John and his supporters out of the congregation. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Challenging a governing body member, the last of the remaining apostles, has to worry about being kicked out of congregations.
But it's because there was no governing body.
There was no governing body. So
Yeah.
another myth attached to the other myth, that there's a faithful and discreet slave class, is the concept of governing body. We've made several videos going to Acts to show that this is a total fiction as well. So I'll link at least one of those to this and the video to follow, where Ray goes more deeply into this class system that the Watchtower has in fact created.